Hi, this is part one of a two-part series about writing tests in Postman. If you're not familiar with sending requests and inspecting the response in Postman, you'll definitely want to check out one of our other videos first. I'll drop the links in the description. So what is a test in Postman? You're probably already familiar with sending an API request and inspecting the response. Tests allow us to programmatically say that the API is behaving as you'd expect it to. The data returned is formatted this way. I get this type of response code, and when I poke at an API in X sort of way, then I predict Y will happen. Let's get started in the Postman app. Make sure you have a Postman account and you're logged in. In the top left, click on the orange New button and tab over to Templates. Let's find a collection called Intro to Writing Tests with examples, and then pull it into our instance of Postman. We can see it in our sidebar here. Go ahead and click the star to bring it up to the top. This collection contains all the examples that we'll be walking through. Click the flyout next to the collection name and click View in Web. Now we're in our browser. This is web documentation that corresponds to our sample collection. If you're following along in real time, feel free to pause the video when you want to and try out the examples with your own endpoints in the Postman app, or dig a little bit deeper in the documentation here. All right, back to Postman. Let's take a look at this first folder called Basic Test Syntax and load up our first request called pm.test. The API we're using here is Postman's echo API that simply echoes a request back to us. Once we send our request, we can inspect our response and see that the response is as we'd expected. We know how to do that manually. Now let's do it programmatically by writing a test. In the request builder on top, we have two very special tabs, Pre-request and Tests. You can write JavaScript that'll execute either before or after this main request. Under these tabs, we can access the Postman sandbox and use the pm.star API. Let's focus on the Tests tab. If you're just getting started with Postman tests, take a look at these snippets in the sidebar. They're commonly used tests that can be added to your test script. Here on line 6, we see a Postman test. We're using the pm.star API, specifically it's the pm.test function that accepts two parameters. The first parameter is the name of our test. Name your test descriptively so that when it fails, you know which expected behavior has failed. The second parameter is a function where we use the pm.response function to make a single assertion, that our response will have a 200 status code. If this assertion throws an error, meaning it's not true, then this test fails. Here on line 12, we see another Postman test with a bunch of assertions. If any of these assertions throws an error, then the entire test fails. All right, let's move on to our next request, pm.expect and pm.response. pm.expect is a generic assertion borrowed from Chai.js, a behavior-driven development or BDD assertion library for Node. For our base assertion, we can use pm.response like we did before, which actually uses pm.expect under the hood. Whenever possible, if you use pm.response to make your base assertions, the error message that displays when a test fails will be more descriptive. Let's take a look at what that looks like. Okay, from line 1 to 8, we are essentially making the same assertion in two separate Postman tests, one using pm.response and one using pm.expect. Let's hit send. And both tests pass because the response code is 200, like we asserted. Now let's tweak our tests so that they'll fail. Change our 200s to 201s, and hit send again. Now both of our tests have failed, and when we look at the failure messages, you can see that the test written using pm.response has a little bit more information. Not only do you have the comparison of the value you asserted and what was actually returned, you also have information about the key or field that failed. It's a subtle difference, but when you're debugging, writing your assertions using pm.response whenever possible will provide a little bit more visibility into these failures. Okay, last bit here. If you are using pm.expect, this function accepts an optional second parameter that allows you to write a custom error message. Let's uncomment this bit of code and hit send. Here we forced a test failure by asserting false to be okay, which is not okay. And when that test failed, we can see our custom error message in the test results. This is especially helpful for debugging as you're writing your tests. Okay, enough with test syntax. Let's take a look at this second folder called API tests. When people talk about unit tests for an API, they most likely mean testing a single HTTP API request. Similar to how software unit tests are written to assess the smallest unit of functionality, you can think of an API test like a unit test. With this type of testing, you may or may not have access to the underlying code. However, you can validate that an API behaves as expected from the user's perspective. There's a bunch of examples in this folder. Let's take a look at Json Schema v4 validation. If your team works with a schema, then you'll write tests validating that the response payload conforms to an expected structure or format. You can define your schema here, or keep it dry and save this schema as a collection variable so that you can reuse it across a bunch of requests within your collection. Once again, we'll write our test. We expect something to be true. What's this something? Here, we'll use the TV4 library that's part of the Postman sandbox to more easily validate simple values or complex objects. There's a bunch of other API test examples in this folder. Take a look and try it out with your own endpoints. And so that's it. So in part 1, we walk through basic test syntax and some common validation tests. 3 quick tips for test syntax. Name your test descriptively so that when it fails, you know which expected behavior has failed. Use pm.response whenever possible for more descriptive error messages. And create custom error messages to be even more descriptive with pm.expect. Coming up in part 2, we'll dig deeper into integration testing, variables, and more ways to automate your tests. Stay tuned.